I'm John Travis here in Mullumbimby, New South Wales on the, I forgot to look at the date again. I think it's the 13th here and the 12th there, 2020. And I have the pleasure of seeing Joan Bordow again after 20 some years, who I spent many hundreds of hours with back in the 80s and early 90s when she was leading seminars for Landmark. And oh, this is a delight, Joan. I intend to find out a lot more about you. I mean, you were great at telling stories on yourself.
Yes.
Mostly current ones at the time, but how you got into all this work and what shaped your direction. I consider Landmark a major contributor to my wellness and to the wellness of the planet. And you, as the person I was actually most connected with during more time with you than anyone else. And I enjoyed your you were actually just getting started when I met you, and not as shaped by the standard Landmark format, and more rebellious. And plus you're a woman, and all the others I've worked with were men. So anyway, let's get into what how you got, where were you born, siblings, what your earliest influences were, and then we'll work our way through your history to where we met.
Sure. I was born in Brooklyn, and so I am a New York Jew.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I've lived in California for most of my life, that kind of sarcastic, aggressive way of being really shaped me. When I finally came out to California, I was in my late 20s, and I noticed that the kind of sarcasm that's like the coin of the realm in New York interactions wasn't the way it is here, and people were puzzled by a lot of the things I said. They did not get New York humor, but I think in the intervening many years, people here are more attuned to that than they were then.
And an enormous number of New Yorkers, like Mill Valley, got invaded by New Yorkers in the 70s. So
did you live in Mill Valley? Did you live there?
Yeah, 69 and then again 70 to 80. 75.
Yeah.
That's where I started my wellness center in 75, was in Mill
Such
Valley.
a beautiful place. You know, it's still beautiful.
Yeah, just too cold. Chill Valley is what we have to call it.
Because the fog gets there? Ah.
That's the one drawback. Plus the fact it's overrun with aliens. So you adapted to your California environment?
Yes, beautifully. Well, I at the time, my husband at the time could work anywhere because he was importing jewelry and clothing from mainly from Morocco. So really we could live anywhere, and I was pregnant and I didn't want to have a baby in an urban environment. So I switched to a less urban environment. We moved to San Francisco in 1970.
Uh-huh.
And I have 3 children. They were all born here. And then we moved out to Sonoma County after about 3 years.
Interesting. Now let's go back actually to your childhood. And,
sure.
The siblings and birth order and early experiences that interested you in matters psychological and health.
Oh, we're going to get into all that. Okay.
Did you play nurse?
Sorry, what?
Did you play nurse or doctor when you were little?
I think so. I think I played doctor with the boy next door whose name was Epi.
Uh-huh.
That was his nickname. His real name was Philip. Let's see, birth order. I had one sibling, a girl who was 4 years older than me, and so much of my identity was defined by virtue of what was left for me to be, given that she had you know, certain qualities and characteristics and things she was known for. So, you know, I couldn't be that. So I couldn't be the high academic achiever. She was already the high academic achiever. I couldn't be the artistic one in terms of like painting, because she was already that. I couldn't be the oldest one. So I became, you said before, well, I was kind of rebellious, but I became rebellious. And I'm still kind of rebellious.
And outspoken and speaking the truth, I would say.
Yeah, speaking my truth, which coincided with others. I mean, I think something that has always been allowed for, not always been, in my adult years, has been allowed for by me is that I am going to do what I want to do, and I encourage others to do the same. I would say that the way of being that's most called to me through my life is being free to be. And it isn't that I'm always free to be. It's just that if I can find myself, for example, like in my life, I've made certain agreements with jobs I've had, relationships I've been in, and I've made those agreements because there was something I didn't want to lose, like I didn't want to get fired, or I didn't want to lose the relationship. There would usually come a point where the loss of the job or the loss of the relationship was less important to me than being free and being honest and being authentic. Like the pressure, I feel an almost internal pressure that I couldn't tolerate. So it was like, well, okay, maybe they'll fire me if I say this, but it's too uncomfortable. It's too physically, it's too psychologically uncomfortable for me to not say it.
How was that for you in school or with your family? Did you get stood in the corner or what?
No, I think I was able to hide that stuff at school. But never with my family. You know, I was the black sheep. I was the black sheep. So, you know, during the Vietnam War, my sister was on one side of the generation gap, and I admired my sister. I wanted to be like my sister, but she was very conservative, so she was on the side of the generation gap that thought the government knew what it was doing and the government was honest with its people always because it was the government. And I was like a raving lunatic on the other side. I was related to by my parents and sister as being a raving lunatic.
Did they ever come to see the error of their ways?
I don't think it was the error of their ways that they saw, but I think at one point, first of all, I found ways to communicate with them that wasn't as inflammatory. You know, I was like out to inflame them. I was glad there was a gap and I was on one side and they were on the other. And that became less important for me than loving them. And
Mm-hmm.
I remember during the era of the second Bush's presidency, where my sister and brother-in-law voted for them a second time. So, you know, I could kind of forgive them the first time because who knew how he
Yeah,
would
right.
turn out. But that they had voted for him the second time, that drove me crazy. Now, my sister was fine with me having the political leanings that I had. That wasn't a problem for her. That she had voted Republican was a big problem for me. I thought she had ruined the futures of my children and grandchildren. And so I would do this thing where we would talk. She was living in Florida, I was living in California. And I would manage to bait her into arguing with me. That was not her nature. She didn't want to do that. And at one point, I just got disgusted with myself. It was fun for a while, and I got to be right about how she was and the uncaring and unfeeling person that I wanted her to be. So I said to her, look, you know, we're going to take a hiatus from talking at all because I can see that it isn't good for me and it isn't good for you. And we did. I just didn't call her. She didn't call me. And at one point I called her and I said, it's more important for me to talk to you than to put you into an argument with me. And so I am never going to talk to you about politics again. I'm going to talk to you about things we're mutually interested in, our kids' lives and the lives of our grandchildren, and things that we won't get crazy about. And we did, and we had a beautiful relationship. And I saw that you can actually do that without compromising yourself.
Getting off it, as Landmark
Getting off it, exactly. And like
was.
being cause in the matter and not being a big idiot. Those are all good things.
Would you rather be right or be loved?
Would you rather be right or have health, happiness, satisfaction, expression, love? All the
Now,
things that make life worthwhile.
Despite your differences when you were younger and you were trying to find a niche where she hadn't already filled it, what was your relationship like when you were kids? Were you fairly close?
Well, no, we were not very close. She was 4 years older than me. And on our street in Brooklyn, my cousin Nancy lived right across the street, and she and my sister were like 2 weeks apart in age. And they were really tight. They were just best friends. And one of their favorite games was torturing me.
Oh.
And I wanted to do anything to belong with them and have them play with me. And they were having none of it. The only times they played with me was when I would go crying to my mom. And then my mother would like walk in and say that they had to, which of course they further resented me for. And they would play with me, but they would make me take some role that no one would want to play. So like if they were royalty in the game, then I got to be the ogre. or the servant, or something neither of them wanted to be.
Did you have any friends your age that you found, or how was it?
Yeah. You know, it was such a different era. This was the 40s and 50s in Brooklyn, and where when you got home from school, you would go play right out on the street, you know, sometimes in the middle of the street. And there's just like crowds of kids, and you could do that till your mom would stick her head out of the window and make you come home for dinner. And it was great.
There was a famous fellow that wrote a book called Ringo Livio that was set in Brooklyn in the streets. I read that book, and yeah, that. So you must be older than I thought you were. You must be about my age then. What year were you
How
born?
old are you?
77, born in January 43.
I'm in April, I'll be 76.
Uh-huh. Well, I've always thought you were 10 years younger than me, so, and you
I
still look it.
know. Yeah.
So what do you owe your youthfulness?
Um,
Being free, probably.
well, one thing is I inherited a good set of genes from my parents. My father lived until he was 94 with all of his faculties. My mother lived till she was only 78, but that's mainly because she smoked for her entire life. And, you know, her respiratory illness is what killed her. But, you know, I've done yoga religiously since the early 60s, and I eat well. I go to the gym 6 days a week.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Well, now, any more on school and what your experiences were? What kind of school did you go to? And
I went to a New York City public school, which were great at the time. They're amazing. And one of the things that shaped me a lot was there was this test that every child took in the 6th grade. And the New York City school system at that time had, you went to primary school through the 6th grade, and then you went to 7th, 8th, and 9th grade in a junior high school. And then you went to high school, sophomore, junior, senior year. And the test, if you passed the test with a certain grade, then you went to junior high for 2 years instead of 3. It was a highly accelerated program. And I was very adept at language arts, and I was a very bad math student. And I failed the math part of the test, and my teacher really thought I should be in the rapid advanced program. So she asked my mother if I could have tutoring and then retake the test. And a couple of times a week, I would go to the house of this very smart girl, Harriet Gold. And Harriet Gold was ostensibly my math tutor, but mainly she would talk and I would daydream, and we would do problems and she would fix them for me. And I retook the test and I failed the math part. I just took the math part of the test and I failed it again. And I was horrified, because every single one of my friends, which was this large group of friends, had passed. And I lied to them and I told them I passed. And then what happened was that summer we moved to Long Island. So I never had to tell anybody that I lied. I
Mm.
never had to admit to my friends that I lied. And I knew after that that I was stupid, and I was always going to have to hide that to be acceptable to people.
Wow.
Yeah, and I mean it. It was one of the things that shaped me in my life, that I had to overcome the experience of that I was stupid. I mean, I had no doubt that I was really stupid. I thought, yes, I really am, because I'm bad at math. And nobody else I know is bad at math, and I'm bad at math. And that I excelled in other areas was not any piece of evidence for me that I was bright and intelligent. And so there's always that piece of fraudulence that I was always dealing with, like hiding.
Mm. It's remarkably similar to Dean Ornish's story a couple of days ago, when he actually was suicidal from getting thrust into an academic situation that was untenable, and he thought he was stupid, and look what happened with him.
Yeah,
So,
then he became an overachiever,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
Dean and I have the same guru.
Oh, Satchidananda, huh?
Yeah, I was Satchidananda's secretary.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Huh. Did you know each other back in those days?
He may have known who I was because I was Gurudev's secretary. I didn't know of him till after I stopped, being Satchidananda's secretary, and he became famous.
Now, were you at Yogaville then, or?
I was not at Yogaville. I was with Satchidananda when he first came to New York. I met him when he first came to New York and was his secretary. I lived with him. We lived in this big apartment on 80th, 80 something, and what avenue was it? West Side? I don't know. It was on the west side.
Well, now this sounds like quite a story in itself. How did you wind up being his secretary? How did you meet?
Okay. Well, I had a loft. My husband, Richie, and I had a loft on Grand Street in New York. And the person with the loft upstairs was our friend Bob. He became our friend because we were neighbors. And Bob introduced us to this English photographer named Malcolm Hart, and Malcolm's girlfriend, who was a model, who was Kathy, her name was Kathy Ainsworth. And Kathy met Satchidananda when, soon after he came to New York. He was brought to New York by Peter Max, who was a pop artist.
Mm-hmm.
And then Kathy invited me to meet him, and I met him. And I had been taking lots of LSD at the time. And Satchidananda was the first person I met who was kind of living some of the principles I discovered from taking psychedelics.
Mm-hmm.
So I was completely blown away by him and just started taking every class he offered. And then he asked me if I'd come live there and be his secretary. So I told my husband that I was moving into the Yoga Institute, and he was welcome to come, but if he didn't come, I was going anyway. And that's how that turned out.
And how did he respond to that? What?
He said, well, I'm gonna, well, my husband and a bunch of friends had a light show and head shop on the Lower East Side. And so by then we had moved into an apartment. We'd moved out of the loft, and he stayed in the apartment, and he'd visit me from time to time, and I stayed up at the yoga center.
So how long did that relationship last after that?
I don't know, maybe 3 more years, because then there's a time I stopped living in the yoga center, and Richie and I moved to California, and then we were together till 1972. So we had been together 7 years.
And you had 1 or 2 kids with him?
One. My oldest daughter, Daisy.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's a gap here. I got carried away with the connection with Satchidananda. Interesting, where I live in Marin Valley, there's a couple who met in the Yogaville or yoga house in Santa Cruz. They were both devotees. Steve and Tara Ploker, you know them? He runs a...
No, but I know, a couple of the people who were from Santa Cruz.
Yeah, well, they wound up getting married.
Yeah.
And they were with Dafri John for a while. And anyway, but let's go back from high school to, you would have graduated probably in 62?
I graduated in 61.
61. Did you skip a year then, or because you're a year?
No.
I thought with you.
I was very. My birthday was in April, so I was young. I was younger than most of my friends.
Yeah. Any other interesting things about high school besides and how was it in Long Island? Meeting new friends? Fit in?
Yeah, it was terrible.
Oh, okay.
It was awful. I thought, I thought that period of time, like the middle school age and high school, it was so much about status and what group you were in and being popular or wanting to be popular, and that didn't seem so important before then in my age group. Like, I don't think we excluded people. I mean, everybody was pretty much included in Brooklyn. Not that we liked everybody the same, but then that was so important when I got to middle school. If you were popular, if you were not popular, and all the meaning that went along with it. It was just unpleasant, uncomfortable. It was an era where I made up so many things about about who I am and the kind of person I am and the kind of person I'm not. It was just loaded with that.
And how did you fit in? Where in the niche? Were you class president or the nerd like?
No, I was a cheerleader.
Oh.
I became a cheerleader. I mean, I was like flexible and a good athlete, and I became a cheerleader. And then I was recruited by the popular girls.
Mm-hmm. And how was that for you?
I knew it kind of added to the fact that I was a fraud, because I knew they only gravitated toward me because I had stature.
What I do rather than who I am.
Yeah. And then, years later, we all got together. It was like a high school reunion. And I said that. I said, well, I knew I didn't really belong. And they, the girls that were there, they said, oh, well, that wasn't how I felt about you. So it sure seemed like that was true. But of course, there's so much for humans that seems true
Mm-hmm.
and doesn't turn out to be true. I mean, at the time, it wasn't an era inside of which there was like open and honest communication. And I would have said to them, I just feel like I don't really belong with you. I would have never said that then.
Right.
Because it would have made me a target for
Yeah.
ridicule. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Any other things about high school in those years? Where in Long Island were you?
I lived in a town called Woodmere.
Is that
And
far out or close in?
no, it's close in. It's right near the Atlantic Ocean.
Mm-hmm.
And the high school I went to was called Lawrence High School.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. My mother grew up in Brooklyn and went to Packer Institute, which I walked by one day and discovered when I was visiting a friend there, and she had friends in Garden City that we visited when I was a teenager.
Yes. Yeah, Garden City was not far from where I lived.
And then from high school, what?
I went to Emerson College in Boston.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I was wanting to be an actress. And I auditioned for 3 different performances that were being put on. I didn't get accepted to any of them, and that was like, I felt devastated by that. And well, the 2 things happened. So that happened, and then I had a boyfriend who had graduated already. He had graduated from the University of Rhode Island, and he was going to move to New York to work. So I thought, I don't want to be in Boston anymore. I want to go home. I'll go home. I'll get a job in the city. I'll have my boyfriend. And so I quit college after 1 semester. And I moved to New York. I lived with my parents for a while, and I worked in the city. And the first job I had was as a receptionist in the garment center. And I started off making $55 a week, which I thought was a tremendous amount of money. It was like this huge amount of money. And since I was living at my parents' house, pretty much I spent the money on whatever I wanted to. And after that, I got a series of jobs in publishing.
Like as editorial work or proofreading?
Generally administrative assistant, secretary, and then at one point, oh, you don't know about this other thing. So at one point, this is when I was with my husband, Richie. It was before I met Sachidananda. I took a job as the assistant to the president of a small publishing company called Fleet Publishing. They published around 30 titles a year. And my boss, who was the president, quit and became a literary agent. And I was a vegetarian. And he said, why don't you write a vegetarian cookbook and write a proposal for it, and I'll sell it. And I wrote a proposal, and he sold it, and it became a very popular hippie vegetarian cookbook called Victory Through Vegetables.
I think I remember that.
Then I had a career as a writer for, I don't know, 10, 12 years.
Really? Huh,
Yeah.
fascinating. Well, you've opened so many doors, I'm not sure which ones to stumble through, but um, that was it for you academically then, a year at Emerson? And
It was it for me academically, and that was another thing I hid for a really long time. So people would say, "So what college did you go to?" And I said, "Oh, Emerson." But I never said, "Oh, Emerson," for one semester. I said, "Oh, Emerson."
well, you got to Boston a little before I did. I was at Tufts Medical, lived in Back Bay, and Emerson was fairly close.
Right there, Back Bay. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
It
I
was
lived on.
right across the street from, I can't remember what the name of the public gardens with the swan boats is.
Oh yeah, the Public Garden. Yeah,
Oh, right across the street from there.
on Arlington probably. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was just back there last summer. Yeah, small world. So you're pretty much a self-educated person, and
Yes, very much.
so let's see. We've got the boyfriend, and back to New York, and working for as a secretary, and then the publishing happened considerably later. Is there anything more in that gap back in New York before you moved to California? Late 60s, the hippie thing was happening. So, and you already,
Yeah, I was definitely a hippie.
how did that happen? What was your first experience with knowing you were a hippie?
I think probably when I started smoking pot,
Mm-hmm.
which was 1962, you know, when I quit college.
Uh-huh. And now were you at Woodstock? Were you,
Definitely. I was definitely at Woodstock. My husband was in a band, and his manager was this man named Michael Lang. And Michael Lang was one of the two people, maybe it's three, who put on Woodstock. And so and also our friend Malcolm had been hired Malcolm was hired to do the movie Woodstock, but then he got edged out by, I can't think of that guy's name, Michael, whoever became the person who made the movie. But Malcolm was then hired to take all of the local color video film for the movie. So everything that's not the performances, all of the so-called street scenes and everything else is Malcolm Hart. And so my husband was on his film crew. So we went early to Woodstock, and the final night of Woodstock, I was just sick of being wet and sleeping in a tent. So I asked Michael Lang if I could sleep in his RV, which was parked right behind the stage. And so I was alone in his RV, and I couldn't sleep because the music was too loud.
Yeah.
And so I was like getting just like 5 or 6 in the morning. And so I got dressed and I went and I sat on the stage, and Jimi Hendrix came out and performed. So when they came out with the movie Woodstock, I thought, oh, I wonder if I'm going to be in the piece about Jimi Hendrix. And I'm not. But then this video came out called Jimi Hendrix Live at Woodstock. And I am really clearly seen in that.
Were you in any of the other street scenes that?
No, but my husband was.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, Malcolm took a bunch of footage of Richie.
What other hippie sort of things were you up to before Woodstock would have been like the crowning event?
Yes, the New York City Be-In,
Mm-hmm.
which happened in Central Park. So I was then working for Peter Max, who was an artist, and I was his administrative assistant. And this guy named Jim Forat. Remember when there were diggers and...
Oh yeah, the Diggers, yeah.
Yeah. So he was part of the New York Diggers, and he was very involved with putting on it was called the Easter Be-In because it was Easter Sunday in Central Park. And he came to Peter Max to ask Peter if he would freely design flyers for the Central Park Be-In. There had been the Golden Gate Park Be-In in January, and that's what was the inspiration for the Easter Be-In in Manhattan. And so my husband and all of his friends went and posted these flyers all over the city. And it said, "Be in Central Park, Easter," and it was beautiful, you know, it was great.
I was in med school at that point and completely, I knew something was going on because the class behind me took over the entire curriculum. We had this very rigid curriculum my third year, and the fourth year was entirely elective, which was wonderful. I got to do some really interesting things, but I couldn't understand what was happening until I got to San Francisco for my internship in the wake of Woodstock, and that was, let's see, July of 69.
Yeah.
And so I was a late comer, a wannabe. I didn't get to my hippie phase till a lot later, but I was in the midst of it and trying to figure out what's going on here. I was a pretty straight medical student. It was April of 70 when I had my awakening, when a patient showed me a paper that Herb Benson had just published, lowering blood pressure with meditation. And that just shook me to the core. And I did an about face in the last months of my internship. And one of our fellow interns was a hippie. And I had pretty much avoided him because he was so weird. Yes. I apprenticed myself to him for 2 months. And he was into Ram Dass and natural foods, and you know, he drove an old bus, and we went over to his house in Mill Valley, and he was living with a woman. You know, I was married, and they still had their Christmas tree up in April, and their couch was a mattress, and I got plunged into it a little late. So
yes.
Then you came to California right around then, was it?
August of 1970.
Uh-huh. So were you in the Haight or whereabouts?
I moved into the Integral Yoga Institute on Dolores Street because my friends were the director and the director's wife. And then Richie and I found an awesome house on Caselli Street in the Castro.
My daughter lived on Caselli Street.
Wow.
Later.
Well, when I lived there, we had this cottage that had it was small, but it had a kitchen and a living room and a dining room, and had an upstairs with 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. And it was fenced in, and it was set back from the street, and our rent was, I don't know, like $110 a month.
Mm.
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
Can you just imagine that? I mean, you know, it was great, but everybody lived that way then.
Yeah.
Everyone I knew had a house and could afford it because it was so cheap.
Yeah. The
And
good old days.
we all had food stamps. So yes, life was very inexpensive.
Yeah. Yeah. Then from there, what you had your daughter?
Yes, I had my daughter. I was writing books. And then I wrote a book called A Motherhood Book. And when it was finished, I decided to go visit my friend Bob in London. And I went with my best friend, Sharon, and my daughter, and not my husband. And ostensibly, we were going for a couple of months, and we're gonna go to London. And then a friend of mine offered me his farmhouse in Ibiza to stay in, and
That's
in
near,
London, huh?
that's somewhere near London.
Oh, Ibiza is an island off of Spain.
Oh, I didn't know
It's
that.
near Majorca.
Oh, okay. I've heard of
Yeah,
that.
yeah. And I went to London, and I met my current spouse the day I got there, and fell in love, and split up with my husband, and you know.
Put up with in terms of he was still back in San Francisco.
Well, Richie was in San Francisco, and I thought it was like a fling
Uh-huh.
with Robin, and then I thought, I want to be with this person. I want to be with this person. And I told Richie that I was not coming back to our marriage. I was wrenching and horrible, and
Yeah.
you know, I didn't want to be married to him anymore.
Well, my work from about the time I met you has been how having children destroys most marriages and nuclear families, and the just insanity of trying to raise a kid with 1 or 2 people. And I'm curious if any of that phenomenon, it's all based on the fact that most Americans are disconnected because of our birthing practices and our child rearing. You know, we're not part of the continuum. And how does any of that ring true for your experience?
No, I had natural childbirth. I nursed my daughter for 2 years. She's like part of my body.
No, I understand that. I mean, from your childhood and Richie's childhood.
Oh God. Oh yeah.
That
Oh
we 40s kids were all raised by Spock or worse, and
yeah.
And we were looking for the mother we never really had. And for the guys, they get married, they think that everything's fine until they have a baby, and then suddenly the guy's job is to earn more money for his wife and her new lover, which is how it feels emotionally to him. And you know, that the overwhelm of the needs of an infant, it takes 3.87 adults per infant to meet everybody's needs. So do the math.
Yeah.
Hard that is on relationships, but
yes.
I'm glad to know you were on board with natural childbirth, or we're calling it normal childbirth now, normal birth.
Yeah.
And nursing. How long did you nurse?
for 2 years.
Good, good. Yeah, that was
Yeah.
important and still unrecognized.
I mean, I think with Richie, we never communicated. We
Mhm.
just didn't communicate. Um, and there were things that were important to me that I wanted, like being appreciated and seen and
Yeah,
known.
yeah.
But I didn't ask for them. You know, I didn't request them. I didn't ask for them, and he didn't provide that. And then, you know, there's this other person there who just was crazy about me. And I
Mm.
thought, this is so much better.
Yeah.
I don't know if, I mean, communication obviously would have made some difference. Responsibility would have made some difference. Having integrity. I didn't come, you know, I wasn't introduced to any of that till I did the S training. And there were certain universal experiences I had through psychedelics that were critical, but still my everyday life
Right.
lacked communication, lacked integrity, lacked authenticity, lacked responsibility. I learned all of that with Werner Erhard.
So I want to get to that because that was we might have even been in the same S training. I was in September B of '75 with Hal Eisen and Jerry Joyner.
Well, that was right after me because I did the August B training with Werner.
Really? Yeah, I missed Werner. I didn't get him until a lot
75.
later.
Yeah, same year, a month later.
Interesting. At the Jack Tar, probably?
No, the first weekend was at the Hyatt Regency. It was
Classy.
Werner was doing it to train the staff and the trainers. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't know that. When I registered for it because it was the last possible training on the whole sheet. It was the one furthest away from when I registered. I wanted a good long time between when I registered so I could decide if I really wanted to do it or not.
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up in this enormous training with a bunch of celebrities. I mean, there were a few celebrities, a lot of people, the entire staff, all of the trainers. And we did the first weekend at the Hyatt Regency in San Francisco, and the second weekend at the St. Francis Hotel.
Is that what the Jack Tar became? I know it changed names.
No,
But...
the St. Francis was right on Union Square. This
Oh, right. Yeah. Pretty
beautiful
classy compared to the Jack Tar.
The polar opposite of the Jack Tar.
And that room that did the training in was the one that caught fire later on, burned out. But not from an S training. But let's go back though in terms of you and Robin and the island, and fill in the gap between when you came back, obviously, to California. And
so I think I left in September. I was going to return in November or December. I left in September. I didn't come back till the middle of January because it got too cold to live on the island.
Mm-hmm.
And then we came back here and.
But Robin was already living on the island and stayed
No,
there?
no, I met Robin in London.
Oh, okay. And she went to the island with you then?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And then when you came back, did she come back too, or?
Yes.
But then you didn't become partners until quite a bit later, because I know when you were doing the seminars, you were with a guy named, was it Rob? Used to
No, but that's because Robert changed his gender. Robin is I've been with now for 47 years.
Oh, that was Robert.
Yeah,
Oh,
yes, that's the same person. I mean,
interesting.
maybe not the same person,
But
but
body or
same entity.
chromosomes.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, sounds like a fascinating whole session
It's
right
a whole
there.
other thing. But I can only talk about my part in that.
Yeah, yeah.
I think more
So,
fascinating piece is what Robin went through.
so you were then with Robin when you
Oh,
did the,
yes, yeah. Yeah, I've been with Robin since 1972, since we got together in London.
okay, so then you had kids with,
Two more.
okay, and it was your youngest one dancing with her one night when she must have been 4 or 5 that led to my deciding to become a father again 21 years after.
Wow.
Uh, yeah, that was
Oh, that's
between,
adorable.
it was that and we were doing, I think it was sex and intimacy or whatever the name of that seminar was.
Sex and intimacy.
Yeah, but it was a party. Was it at your house or somewhere in Petaluma? I
It
just
must have
remember,
been at my house because my
yeah,
house was in Petaluma.
there were a lot of people dancing, and I wound up dancing with your daughter.
No, no. Was it like, I mean, there were a couple of parties that I had that were like big, giant parties at public venues. A couple of my birthday parties.
Yeah, it probably, I think it was bigger than your house.
Yeah, like one was at this club in Katati, and one was at some social center in Santa Rosa.
It could have been either of those.
It could have been either of those. So yeah.
But that was a memorable experience for me.
Uh,
But now let's go back to you met Werner and you were in this training with who were some of the celebrities? Can you say that or is that?
yeah, Cloris Leachman was in it. Moshe Feldenkrais
Uh-huh.
was in it. There were more. Oh, remember Jennifer Jones?
I know the name.
She, at the time, she was still a known actress. There were more. I just can't
Yeah.
remember who they were.
So what was your experience with that training and how did that obviously have a big impact?
Yes, it had a huge impact. So I think it's interesting how I took the S training. I think that might interest you. I had these good friends who created Swami Muktananda's yoga center in Piedmont near Oakland. And their house became his yoga center. They were devotees of Muktananda. And Werner met Muktananda and really, really liked him and told him that he should meet all of the people participating in EST around the country, at the centers around the country. So Werner paid for Swami Muktananda to do this tour and meet people and speak at all the centers. And my friends who were the devotees of Muktananda met Werner because they were going to shepherd Muktananda on this tour. And Werner invited them to come do the S training for free because they'd be working together.
Sure.
And we had made lots of fun of the S training. We referred to the S training as Western bullshit. People would talk about the S training and we would respond that that was Western bullshit because we were yogis.
Yes.
And we knew people could not have the insights people reported having out of the S training in something that was 2 weekends long. We just knew that was not possible. So then they did the S training and they loved it. They loved it and they called me and they said, oh, you have to do the S training. And I felt so betrayed by them. I thought, no, you've gone over to the dark side. I'm not doing that. But then my very best friend, who was a mutual friend of all three of us, ended up doing it. And that I couldn't tolerate that. So that's how I ended up doing the S training. And I, you know, I expected to not like Werner at all. I expected to be able to see what a fraud he was, but I ended up just falling in love with him. I loved him. I loved how real he was and how straight he was with people and how compassionate he was in being brutally straight with people. So I'm gonna maybe.
It's interesting because I only did the training because I was just starting to open my wellness center in Mill Valley, and some of my clients had been to it and were raving about it. Actually, a good friend, David Isaacs, had also done it. I went to an evening introduction and I hated it. I thought it was snake oil, but I went anyway. And when I got there, I could see that yeah, there's a lot to this. And so now back to your after the training, what?
After the training, I was determined to, you know, not participate with EST because I had other things to do. I was involved in a Waldorf school.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I had by then 2 kids and was a very hands-on mom. But I went to the evening session and I registered for the seminar in Santa Rosa. And
Now, when was that? How did you get up to Santa Rosa from the city?
I lived in, because we had moved. We lived
Oh,
in
right, yes.
We lived in Santa Rosa by then.
Uh-huh.
And so I went to the seminar and it was really interesting. I did this seminar called About Sex. And the way they used to stimulate the conversation of about sex was after that people would share and then they would show some sex video.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was more like videos made for adult sex education. I mean, people were naked and they were having sex, but it wasn't like porn.
End, yeah.
And then we would share from watching the sex video. I mean, the stuff that people said, people wouldn't say that stuff publicly anymore. I mean, you know, there was such, looking back, so much misogyny.
Mm.
And it was so ridiculously judgmental about people's bodies and their body types. And, you know, it was a very different era. And of course, at the time, there there wasn't any attention on being sensitive, which is now called political correctness, you know,
Yeah.
but there was just no sensitivity to the listening at
Well,
all.
this around the same era where Stan Dale started his work, first on
Yeah.
the radio and then with High. And it was through High that I met my partner finally at age 68.
Wow. I know a lot of people who have done High stuff that loved it.
Yeah, yeah. It's, well, my partner Yvonne had done 70 weekends when I met her
Wow.
in 2011. She was on staff as a volunteer, and they needed gender balances because more men would sign up than women, so she could go inexpensively. And she loved it. She's done like over 80 now. We've done about a dozen together, and too bad when Harbin burned down and we lost that beautiful building. But so now, where was Robin in this?
Robin was like supporting us financially. So Robin was taking odd jobs, and then Robin decided to go to school and get become an electrical engineer.
Hmm.
So that was a whole thing, a whole big deal. But that's what Robin was doing.
But did what involved with EST? And,
No, Robin did the S training.
okay.
But never was involved the way I was involved. Never did assisting or none of that.
Now, did you hang out at the houseboat in Sausalito? Were you part of that?
I wasn't part of that. My sister-in-law worked on the houseboat as like an assistant housekeeper.
Interesting, because the woman who helped me start the wellness center had spent a lot of time there, and back in the early 70s. So
Who was it?
well, at that point she was Barbara McNeil. She later became Bobby Salsa Ray, or Bobby Burdette. She changed her name a few times and went through transformations. And
Yeah.
she was originally my secretary, but I found out she knew more nutrition than me, and
Wow.
became a coordinator of staff. Well, she was the staff, what do you call it? Put everything together, and was really, I was her right-hand man, so she was my left-hand woman. So we're a great team. And then she up and died of lung cancer, having never smoked, about 5 or 6 years ago. And
wow.
Sad story. But so from there, you went to the seminar, and in Santa Rosa. You're living in Santa Rosa. We're what, in the late 70s now, or mid 70s?
Yeah, late 70s.
Mm-hmm.
Mid to late 70s.
And I got kind of turned off by the EST machine. I thought the distinction between enrollment and sales was enormously useful, but I wasn't experiencing a lot of enrollment. And it was a fellow living out in Cazadero who was in your seminars. Actually, I think the first seminar we did was before you took over. There was a guy leading them, I think, in Santa Rosa right before you took over.
No, right before I took over, the person who trained me was leading, Nancy Kleiman.
Okay, the name is familiar. Yeah, it must have been her.
Yeah.
And he dragged me to, I think it was assisting at the ropes course out at the advanced site. And and then the seminars. I'm trying to remember his name. I can see his face. And he got me into the seminars right around the time that you started. And you were so refreshing. It was like, wow, this, your personal examples that depression was my coping mechanism from early childhood, and I was still depressed actually a lot after my daughter was born, and the same phenomenon of what I was calling male postpartum abandonment syndrome. We now call it relationship abandonment syndrome.
Mm.
But you would make it so real for me. It was amazing how often at the beginning of the seminar I shifted from being depressed to getting excited. And then I remember bringing Marty Rubin into the picture because Bob Fees had tried to get him to a seminar for years. And he introduced me to Marty, and for some reason, Marty agreed to come to an evening with me. I don't know if you were running the evening or not, but then he got into the seminars. We became bosom buddies, still are. It's like we're brothers separated, or twins separated at birth. But back to how did you wind up becoming a seminar leader, and what were the steps there?
Well, first I did the Introduction Leaders Program, which
Right.
at that time was called the Guest Seminar Leaders Program, which, as you know, are the people who lead the guest seminars and talk to people about registering into the Landmark Forum. But at the time it was the S training. I don't know if it was the forum or the train, well, whatever it was. But so I did that program. I didn't expect to do it. My friend Brian very much wanted to do it, and we were best friends. So I went with him to the orientation for it. And I liked it, and I filled out an application, and he didn't get accepted, but I did.
Oh.
And then I went, before it started, I did the 6-day course.
Mm-hmm.
And the day we returned from the 6th day was going to be the first evening of my guest seminar leaders program. And the 6th day was so transformative for me, was so transformational. I was like completely released from my body in the 6th day. And I had the experience of being totally accepted, and I could say anything. I mean, I said anything there. I said things that I had hidden my entire life at the 6-day course. And then I came back into this program that night, which was there was so much artifice. There was just so much appearances, and I knew that this was not the program for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew I would go through the weekend and then I would quit because I was too embarrassed to tell them at the weekend. You know, there are a few hundred people there, and, you know, I didn't want to get called out publicly. So, so I came back from the weekend, and then I thought, well, I don't know, maybe I'll just keep going with this, which has been a theme in my life. Like, oh, I really want to quit, but I'll just hang out for a little while longer. And so I stayed in the program. I hated that program. I hated it. I hated the leader of the program, and everyone else seemed to be just so loving it. And I hated it. I hated the phone calling. Everyone was so straight, and they all wore these straight looking clothes, and I just hated it. But I was really good at registering people, much to my dismay. You know, I never sold a damn thing in my entire life. never liked that, gravitated toward that, not at all, not one bit, and found I was very successful at it. And so I was candidated. I was made a guest seminar leader. And let me think. Yeah, I wasn't all that successful as a guest seminar leader. And then the head of the enrollment department got another job in the organization. And this new person came in who, how she operated with me was so beautiful. She was so acknowledging and validating. I just loved her. And I thought, oh, I should stick around because I love this person. And then I became like the most productive guest seminar leader in the San Francisco Center because I like being with her and I like being appreciated. And it was a long time before I became a seminar leader. I became a seminar leader, maybe it wasn't, it just seemed at the time like a long time. Became a guest seminar leader in 1979. And I became a seminar leader in 1983 or 84. I wasn't interested in being a seminar leader because I thought it just seemed like too much work. Like I didn't want to do all that work and I didn't want to be in the center all the time. But then Werner rolled out what became the forum, and it was called the Symposium. And on the weekend that he did it for the first time, I was in it, and I was just, it was so gorgeous, and it was so deep, and you know, that's when he started using the term possibility. And there was, I went to my center manager and I said, now I want to be a seminar leader because I love this stuff. This stuff is so great. Mm-hmm. So I went into that program. Of course, I hated the program. I hated it. I hated every bit of it. I had that whole sense I didn't belong, and everybody else was like on board with something that I was definitely not on board with. And like I just think the distinctions of that work are so beautiful and so pure and so true and so accurate, and they give people so much access to having a life that really works and is really great. But I never liked the rah stuff.
I remember
at all.
Someone came up with maybe Werner of turning assholes into S-holes and how to prevent that, because that was the result of the S training. Was you had a bunch of people obnoxiously cramming it down men's throats.
Yeah.
And they recognized that problem and came up with that term, which I thought was...
Yeah, it was a good term. But I always, because I had the certain values from being a hippie that I always maintained as my values, and a kind of intellectual freedom, a kind of not going along with the crowd. Of course, there were crowd. I mean, I went along with the hippie crowd, but a kind of um, not joining in with what was mainstream were values I never gave up. They're still my values today, they're still my values. So I think, people enjoyed that about me, that
That was exactly why I kept coming back to the seminars. I wouldn't have continued if whatever her name was that, that you replaced. It was your freshness and authenticity that drew me back. I must have done, 8 or 10 seminars in that period in the late 80s,
yeah.
in the early 90s. That's your gift, one of your gifts anyway. And I'm also remembering that somewhere in there we did one of the first communication courses when that was being rolled out, and I don't remember who led it, but that was a big impact on me. And
Yeah.
the five or six conversations, the last one being the conversation to resolve breakdowns, that was so important. I actually put that in a book that we were writing in 1990, that for helping professionals. I got permission to paraphrase it. And so that communications course, then I did it again later here in Australia, and it had totally changed. That was missing for me.
Yeah.
Then I also did an SELP, and for our viewers, that's Self-Expression and Leadership Program.
Yeah,
SELP.
did I lead that one?
You must have. It was, and I did another one in Charlottesville when I moved to Virginia, and that would have been 95. And out of that came our Alliance for Transforming the Lives of Children, which is still going strong. And we collectively, 13 of us, the original founders, put, including one of the cooks at Woodstock, who was part of that whole movement. We put 10,000 hours into creating the blueprint for transforming the lives of children. So I owe all that to the SELP, plus 2 or 3 others of us in that same, that was the Charlottesville version of it, that were on our board. So had a big impact for me. So
yes, so you must have done that advanced course that we did at the 6-day site.
no, I didn't. I only assisted there, and then I did the advanced course, the new version, in San Francisco with Jerry Joyner. Also, you brought in the Navy SEAL for a forum in Santa Rosa.
Jack Schropp.
Yes.
Jack, I remember we were in that little place in Katati because we couldn't find a location, and it was so much fun. Remember
I thought we were at that kind of a dive Holiday Inn down near Friedman's on.
We may have done one of the days there.
Yeah.
It's quite possible that we did certain things at that crack Holiday Inn.
Yeah. And I remember he stood up in front of the group and he said, "Just so you know, this is what humor looks like," with a deadpan face.
Yes, he died a couple of years ago.
Oh dear.
Yes, and before he died, he had, I think he had Alzheimer's or something cognitive. He was awesome, that guy. I loved him. He was so great.
Now, I got my very straight Air Force pilot, airline commander brother, Mr. Straight, to do it with him, who accidentally confused Palm Springs with what's the other one in Florida? And
Palm Beach.
Palm Beach, because he could fly free. He went to the wrong one.
Oh my God.
But he did get there and he did do it, and it had some impact, though I can't say that he's still pretty straight. Yeah, that was a memorable experience too. So just putting all this into context, because the title of this whole series is Pioneers in Wellness, which I consider Werner to have been a major, to still be a major player. And of course, you who have had the personal connection with, and more than an emissary, because you're in your own right been a pioneer and someone that I've related to, even though we've had this big gap. I would hear about you from Marty when you were doing the wisdom course, and didn't have the opportunity to track you down until this. But as soon as I thought of doing this, it was like, I got to interview you. Now, how did you get from doing the seminars to the wisdom course, and what was your progression there?
I did the wisdom course. They started doing it in the early 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And I had done a course, well, there was this area of Landmark called consulting services that I heard about, but I never participated in because I was too busy being a seminar leader and an SELP leader. But ultimately, I did a course that they had called, oh God, what was it called? At one point it was called Mastery of Well-Being, but when I did it, it was called something else, and it was 2 months long. It was every weekend for 2 months.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was a big, big time commitment and a big, big money commitment. It was a couple of $2,000-3,000, and this was in the late 80s, and I did it, and I was able in that course to resolve my relationship to Robin changing her gender, and was able to be completely upfront about it, which I hadn't been. And I hadn't been because, quite frankly, I found that there was a lot of people who were quite sexist in the other part of the organization. Homophobic, sexist, and that even when people were kind of beginning to accept gay people, they were not accepting transgender people who they, you know, kind of equated with drag, solely with drag, or cross-dressing. It wasn't like it is in California now, or New York now, or even Texas now, or, you know, it was considered weird, dangerous, like, so I just didn't tell anybody about it. And the people I did tell, I had a bunch of friends who said, well, if my husband did that, I could not be with him anymore. I couldn't live with him. So I just stopped talking to those people because I felt, why the hell would I talk to them about my life?
Mm-hmm.
So I felt very isolated with regard to that. And then I did this program and was so accepted by Helen Caldicott, who led the program, and then so accepted by there were only like 8 or 9 people in the program. We were just this close, amazing close group. So that was my introduction to the area which was about to house the wisdom course. Mm-hmm. And I felt like I was so much more at home there. Mm-hmm. And I could just be myself there. So without any artifice, I felt in any other part of Landmark that I was totally accepted exactly the way I was, exactly the way I wasn't, you know, like the experience that I was whole and complete. so then when the wisdom course came out and I did the wisdom course, I thought, oh, this is what I want to do. That's why.
Now, I missed the wisdom course. It was just coming out, and I think I moved to Virginia. And how widespread was it? How many trainers were there, and were you one of the few, or was it widespread?
It was a handful.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't a lot. At one, I don't think there's ever more than 15 at one time. We give it in Australia over the web.
Oh, really?
Where do you live?
Well, I'm in Novato half the year, and here in
Right.
Mullumbimby the other half. I'm here.
What bigger city are you near?
Brisbane, closest to Brisbane.
Oh yeah, well the person who leads it, who you ought to meet because he is spectacular, this guy Andy Monks, who's this crazy artist. You should meet him. He delivers it.
Introduce us. Yeah.
I will. I definitely will. You'll love him. He's this young guy. He's adorable and he's real and
yeah. So for our viewers, just the wisdom course, how would you describe it in 25 words or less, and how does it differ from the forum, which is probably better known? And
well, you can't do the wisdom course without having done the forum. The forum is basic. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The wisdom course is about becoming an adult that is not threatened.
That's pretty powerful.
It's so powerful, and so much of it incorporates play.
Wow.
So one of the main distinctions of the wisdom course is play, which is defined as give and take without intent. So it's about growing and developing through play. It's beautiful. It's brilliant.
Sign me up.
I mean, I know you'd love it. And I led it for at least 20 years. And every year when I led it more of itself became disclosed to me. So it wasn't like I was ever leading it like, oh, I've led this before and I know this. And every year when I led it, I felt there were new facets that I had never seen before that now I was seeing for the first time. And so I could share that with the participants. So every year I led it, I had the thought, oh, everyone who came before this group got shortchanged because I really never saw that before. And it just, it was just, my mentor was this genius named Brian Regner, who invented it. And he was like, he's retired now in Landmark. He still leads certain things, like he leads a facilitated wisdom course, but facilitated because it's purely over the web. I guess you could do that, but you won't get all the distinctions of the real wisdom course if you did that. But Brian Regner was, he's a genius, and he's a creative genius, and he worked really closely with Werner and would just make up stuff. He's very eclectic and very interested in esoteric stuff and Heidegger and Gadamer and, the things, the ideas he brought in Plus, he was all about loving people and playing with people. And he was hysterically funny. So he's like the best person to learn from.
Wow. Yeah, and I can see you can be hysterically funny too, so it's a natural fit
No,
for you.
here's what I loved about him. I was always like, in the group of wisdom course leaders, sometimes people were very, they like other humans, like all of us, they wanted to be part of the group and they wanted to belong. And so he'd be training us with some new thing he'd come up with, and he'd say something like, yeah, and I think we should go east. We should just go east. And I'd be like, what? And everybody else would be saying, yes, we should go east. We should, yes, Brian, that was just brilliant. And yes, we should go east. And I'd be sitting there like, what? That's just crazy talk. That's insane. I wouldn't say anything. But at some point, like, I couldn't not say something. And I'd say, and I know, I was going to look like the bad person or the wrong person. So it would always take something for me. Yeah, it would take something for me to open my mouth, because it was like, So I'd say, I just think that's insane. I can't see how we would ever do that. And he would burst out laughing. And he would always, how he always was with me was completely appreciative. So he was never like, shut up, what do you know? Or you don't know what I'm talking about, or they're right, and no, he was just like so accepting of what I had to say, and like, yeah, we should consider that. We should really consider what you're saying. He was so non-dogmatic and so didn't have to protect himself. He was such a model of being a non-threatened adult. Just like he was able to hear it, like, oh, yeah, I could. So he was great.
So you must have taught, how many wisdom courses a year during the 20-year period?
A bunch, because at one point I went on staff and I led more than one every year. So wisdom courses took almost a whole year, because they were like every other month for a year. So I couldn't lead more than 2. I think, yeah, I never led more than 2, but I did lots of training, and I worked with him in developing new products. And
so it's a weekend, a weekend once every other.
3-day weekend every other month. And in Australia, there's a group in Brisbane, and because Andy leads it over the web. So there's people in Brisbane, and there's people in Sydney, and there's people in Melbourne, and there's like people all over in Tasmania and in New Zealand, and there's like over 100 people in that course, and they're the best. Oh my God. I created the course in Australia over the web. Those people, they're so great. You should meet them. They're so awesome. They're just beautiful.
Because I live in both places. I'm only in each place half the year, the warm half of the year. I'm here another 6 weeks before I head back. that could be problematic of doing a physical one, but maybe
No, I think you could go, yeah, but you know, you could probably, I don't know, they're like usually coordinated so that they're not that far off with each other.
Mm-hmm.
You should, we should like get you in touch with Andy soon, because I think the one there is going to start soon.
Oh, good to know.
I'll just email you his info,
Okay,
and I'll email both of you each other's info
yeah,
at in the same email.
great. So a couple of loose ends here. Back with Robin now, obviously for our viewers, he changed from male phenotype or to female because you have two kids with him.
Yeah.
But he was known as Robert when you were talking about him in those days, and I remember meeting him and
Yeah.
her, and
Well, who you
told
met
us,
was you met him.
yeah,
I don't think you ever met her.
right, and you were telling such great stories about him. I mean, poor guy, but it was mostly about you, and that was one of the high points of the beginning of each seminar was what had transpired with you and Robert that week.
No, we just have such a good relationship. It's
Yeah,
really awesome.
that was obvious. And so you're living where now? In
Petaluma.
Petaluma, okay. Hope I get a chance to meet her after all these years. I
Yeah.
he was at the party. I think was probably the only time I ever ran into him face to face. But and that your youngest daughter, what was her name?
Alyssa.
Alyssa. She must be in her 30s now, and
She's a dentist.
interesting.
Yeah.
I still the freedom that she danced with me. It was like of all the dancing, and I generally have trouble dancing. My mother forced us to do ballroom dancing when I was in high school, and I hated it. I had two left feet and very self-conscious, kind of nerdish. But I just cut loose with her because it was so freeing to her non-judgmentality. And if she had any idea the impact that half hour or so had on my life of deciding to become
I'll tell her. She'll love hearing that.
So now grandkids and
Yes, I have, from my two older daughters, I have my granddaughter Lily, who's 21.
mm-hmm.
And I have from my middle daughter, Dandy, I have my granddaughter Lola, who is 12, and my
Mm-hmm.
grandson Ethan, who is 8.
And where are they at? Nearby, I hope?
Yeah, Daisy lives in Petaluma, and Dandy lives in Oakland, and Alyssa lives in San Francisco.
So you get to see your grandkids
A lot.
Way, yeah.
A lot.
My two daughters, granddaughters, my older daughter, who was born in '72, and we separated when she was only 2.5. So we had a lot of healing, which we've been doing. She lives in Mill Valley, and her daughters are 13 and just coming on 10, I think, next week. So I get to see a lot more of them, having connected with Yvonne and spending a lot more time. I was mostly in Australia since 2000. I'd come back for 3 months in the summers there, but now I'm there a little over 6 months. And right there in Marin, since we moved to Marin Valley, so I get to see a lot more of them. And granddaughters are a trip.
Yes, wonderful.
So that was one of the threads I wanted to follow. And this has been so much fun. I love doing this, particularly with people I know, but even with people I didn't know, like Helen Caldicott, who I never met, but I had admired.
Wow.
We had like An hour, well, it's only 45 minutes, but we her daughter is the founder of the Integrative Medicine Society for Australia. So, and she comes up to Mullumbimby. So all these connections. And I knew of Helen back in the 70s when she started Position for Social Responsibility. And then
And wasn't she involved in Beyond War?
No, might have been connected, but
Yeah.
he actually met with Reagan for an hour and a quarter and had him convinced to end nuclear weapons. But she also knows that he was Alzheimer's, early Alzheimer's, before anyone knew it. She picked it up. And then he and Gorbachev got together, but he got enamored with Star Wars and his naive idea of it. She said his IQ was only about 100. And that shot that down, but she did amazing stuff. And then my dear friend Jeff Patterson, who was in Madison, Wisconsin, who had come to California for one of our weekends or week-longs back in 77 or so, he took over as president of PSR and went to Chernobyl and went to Fukushima and had known Helen really well. And then he up and died suddenly a few years ago. All these connections. So
yes.
I'm getting so much juice out of this project.
Yeah.
Yeah, getting a cent for it. It's out of pocket, some expenses, but it's certainly given me a whole new purpose and sense of meaning to track you all down and document this before it's lost. And unfortunately, some of the people that I interviewed have died, like Jean Liedloff and Peter Cook, who was the Australian counterpart. But I've got 400 names now. You're about numbers of the on the list. I'll never finish the project. I keep coming up with more.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious because of your proximity and what I got involved with after I left the States and came to Australia was Susan Campbell's work in Getting Real, and she's up in Sebastopol. And
I'm not familiar with her work.
You guys would be like sisters. It's amazing.
Good. Maybe you should introduce us.
I shall. Yeah, she's such a hoot. She's 78 or 79, but very young. She goes wild dancing every weekend in Sebastopol, and
yes, ecstatic dancing.
Well, she's such an inspiration. Her distinction between communicating to control versus communicating to connect or relate.
Wow.
It was like, huh? There's another way. Like,
yeah.
So now
wow.
So, anyway.
Well, I retired 3 years ago.
Yes, I heard that from Marty. And so how are you spending your time in retirement?
Well, first, I just read a lot because I felt book deprived. So when I first retired, I laid on my couch and just read. I still do, but then I was like frenetic about it because I couldn't read enough. And then
what kind of reading?
Whatever I wanted. I have this rule that if I read a novel, then after it, I must read something more socially and intellectually redeeming. So right now, here's what I'm reading. This is my latest book. This is Steven Pinker's book called Enlightenment Now. And I read recently the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, and I read this spectacular book are you familiar with Charles Eisenstein?
I know him well. In fact, he's on my list. I took him, when he came to Australia, I took him to this private beach that I know of, and along with Lissa Rankin, who was with him, and we became buddies.
Oh, good, because I just read Climate, A New Story. Mm-hmm. Which is, I think, his latest book, which is so beautiful.
What a thinker, and
what a thinker!
Yeah, he's so down to earth and real.
I'd love to meet him. I
Yeah,
haven't, do you know Kurt Hill?
no.
He was the seminar leader. He loves Charles Eisenstein.
Ah,
If you come here and you're with Charles Eisenstein, I have to meet him, and Kurt Hill has to meet him.
well, um, I found back when I was in had my wellness center, the only nonfiction book, the only fiction book, everything was nonfiction. Like Jean Houston and her husband, they had a fascinating book. You know, the usual. There wasn't much in 1975, but the only nonfiction was Kurt Vonnegut's. The one about Ice Nine and
Not
Lacona.
Slaughterhouse-Five.
Oh,
No.
I just reread it for the third time.
The one with Ice Nine. That was
Yeah,
the first Vonnegut book I ever read.
yeah, fantastic book. And things like Jitterbug Perfume. And,
Love Jitterbug Perfume. I
and then
love that book.
Dion Fortune's, which one was it? There's two of them. That's the second one about the doctor in England, the repressed doctor and meeting the goddess. I don't know if you know Dion Fortune's work, but that hit home for me so deeply. But I'm finding that a lot in fiction is very powerful too. And but I've read all of Robert Parker's stories from Boston with what's his name, the crazy detective, and then there's Travis McGee in Florida. Those are my escape. But, yeah, reading is becoming a lost art. But so what else you started to say besides reading?
So I did that for a long time, and then people would ask me, they'd say, do you do coaching? And I'd say, no. And they would say, well, what would you charge me to coach you? I said, and I'd make up some price. And so I have a couple of people I coach. And then I led this course last year that I created with a couple of friends of mine. Their course is called the Pleasure Course. And then, No, well, the course I lead with them, which I wrote, is the Pleasure Course for people over 60.
Double
and yes, and we're going to do that the end of June in San Francisco. But we may have to move it further out because of the coronavirus. And I also created another course with a friend of mine, which is just for women. And it's called Truth and Grace. And it's about being authentic about what you're really committed to in life and not suffering about your pretense about commitment. But that may have to be moved too, because everyone's crazed here. And I mean, with maybe some good reason. I was supposed to go to Spain in a couple of weeks, and I had to cancel that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for our viewers, and 20 years in the future, possibly, this is the first stages of the COVID-19 viral thing, which will probably be either remembered as a huge tragedy or a big farce in terms of it definitely is killing compromised people and people like in China that were extremely toxic environments that they lived in and so forth. But we don't know at this point. Trump just banned travel from Europe and then backpedaled some. And I'm scheduled to come to California middle of April, whether that'll happen or not. Yeah, there's widespread panic fueled by the media. And my question is, follow the money. And is this big pharma positioning themselves for yet another ineffective vaccine, which can't possibly work because it mutates so fast. But enough of that. What do you do for fun and pleasure?
So much, because before I retired, the thing that concerned me most, maybe not most, but it was up there, was that I didn't have any friends, because all I had done was work for, over 20 years.
Uh-huh.
So then I really made it my business to make friends with people. So I accepted almost every invitation that was made to me, like, hey, do you want to, there's this writer at the local bookstore. Do you want to go hear what he has to say? Yes. Do you want to go to lunch? Yes. And so I have a really great, fun social life. And I have a particular camp I go to at Burning Man with a bunch of people, and that's, I see that group all year, and I have a bunch of friends.
Great, great. Well, I'm just having this fantasy of Marty and I descending on you someday to play. I have
Yes.
more Marty. He's so wild and crazy. I still remember when he was a medical director for mental health in Sonoma County at the county hospital, introducing himself at a staff meeting, saying, "I'm Dr. Rubin. I'm in charge of putting the Prozac in the water," and stuff like that. He was.
That's great.
Of course, he had done his training with Roger Walsh down in Southern California, and
who is he?
He was a devotee, or not. You remember the third Ramdas, Leary, and the third guy who just died,
Ralph Metzner.
Ralph Metzner, yeah. Roger Walsh and his wife, I've forgotten her name, they're big in the transpersonal thing. And they had this psychiatry program at UC Irvine that was transpersonal. And these residents would all go off and do mushrooms together in the Kern River. And so Marty hired other graduates, and the whole psych department at the hospital were these people. And
wow.
That was back in the 90s. And then Carol died of breast cancer. And
yes.
He wound up marrying a woman in Davis and had to move there because she couldn't leave the area. And then he worked for Kaiser for a number of years till he couldn't stand it anymore. He did a lot of innovations there. And now he's at the medical school with, I'm forgetting her name, but she's the one that connected me with you.
Louise?
Yeah, Louise, yeah.
Louise Glazer.
No, actually, she's one of them. There's the other woman. I just emailed you her name.
Rochelle.
Yes.
Yes.
And they're doing radical stuff in a medical school. When I found out, Marty was doing seminars with the medical students, disguised, of course.
Yeah.
So he and I did a presentation there last November on burnout, and
Louise was doing a bunch of stuff about communication there.
Yes, yeah, and yeah. I haven't actually met her, but
she's just fabulous.
Yeah. So anyway, Marty and I are he's probably my best playmate in the world. We've done more crazy stuff.
Don't you just love the people you've done the crazy stuff
with? When I was really depressed shortly after my second daughter was born, and I was deep into what I later named as postpartum depression, male postpartum depression, I would meet up with him in Ukiah. He came up for a clinic in Cloverdale once a month. And I would go to pick up cement blocks in my pickup truck because I was building a greenhouse, and he'd meet me there and we'd go together. He was wearing his coat and tie and I was in my work gear, And unbeknownst to me, he told the yard man that I was a psych patient out on a pass. That's the kind of stuff.
Yes, that's great.
Yeah. So we still play a lot, and it's so important. What's his name? Stuart Brown, who's done a lot of work on play. I'm planning to interview, and how little of it, how our kids have lost the freedom. Like Little League completely changes the game it's the adults' rules, and sandlot baseball, even though I was terrible at it, I'd be the last one picked. We learned how to play with each other and make up our own rules. And kids don't get that anymore because of all of the programming. And true play is becoming a lost art. So anything with the word play that's the real meaning of it, much like the word wellness, it's been bastardized. And
Yes.
so, well, I'm.
Jack, am I early, or would you like a little more time?
I didn't even know we had a call scheduled. I'm interviewing Joan Bordow for my project. Can you see Joan?
We have. Well, Pat and I thought this was the night for the couples call.
Well,
We marked it down that way for tonight.
I don't have it marked down for that. I have it as next week. So let me call you back, and can you hang up so I can finish up with Joan?
Sure, we can hang up.
Let's do this. Let's do it next week.
Okay.
If that'll work for Yvonne.
Great.
Does that work next week?
I think so. I'm in the middle of an interview, so I can't access my computer right now.
Sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead, and we'll reconvene. And
All right.
These great interviews, so I won't interrupt the making of history.
All right.
Bye-bye.
She's my SELP trainer, actually. Well, you just met my other best friend besides Marty, who's in Charlottesville, Virginia.
Ah,
We do couples coaching once a month. We actually stay with them for 2 weeks because I moved to Virginia because of Kent back in the 90s. And he and his wife are dear friends, and we stay with them and every day we do like an hour or two, the two couples, owning our projections. And Kent is perfect at triggering all of my buttons. We grew up in similar families where we, our critical tones of voice come out all the time. So we do this monthly call, and I'm pretty sure it was scheduled for next week. But anyway.
is that couples coaching couples? Is that part of that group? There's a group I've heard of called Couples Coaching Couples.
Actually, there's a woman in Charlottesville who I think is the same group that Kent was a part of. And I was in the seminars with her back when I moved to Charlottesville.
What's her name?
I'm trying to think of it. I can see her face, but we made this up on our own based on that, but we're independent. We haven't any association.
This is independent couples coaching other independent couples.
Yeah. Well, it's been a wonderful experience for us, and we do it by Skype, or actually the same Zoom room once a month. And we'll be actually being there in July, which will conflict with your course in July, unfortunately. And
I don't have it in July. I have it in June.
oh, I thought you said end of. We're going out 24th of June. So.
Yeah. Well, maybe, I don't know. I'll find the dates and
Okay.
send them to you anyway. And we may, like I said, depending upon this virus and when it peaks and when it comes down, we may have to change the date.
We're certainly living in uncertain times. And
when you were in Charlottesville, did you ever get to Yogaville?
Not when I was there, actually. I would shop at their local health food store, which is right next door to Kent's office.
Oh.
And I knew of Sandra McClanahan from when I lived in Cazadero in the 80s. I had a conversation with her, and I learned about the work she and Dean were doing. But ironically, I never got down there in the 4 or 5 years I lived. I actually was outside there in Nelson County in an intentional community called Shannon Farm, which is the oldest, largest hippie consensus-run community. We were on the other side of Charlottesville from Twin Oaks, which is the better known one, that was based on, what's his name, Skinner's book, Walden, what was it, Walden 2? Or I can't remember the book. Anyway, yeah, so I got there finally about 3 years ago. They sponsored a wellness seminar at the Unity Church in Charlottesville, and Sandra was invited in, and so we met up, and then she had us come down. We got the grand tour of the place, and wow, I had no idea all that was right there just south of Charlottesville. And in fact, I'm going to be interviewing her soon too. And yeah, small world. So, well, I'm sure we could go on for a few more hours.
Yeah, probably.
I'm just delighted to reconnect with you after all these years, and to remember how important you were in my path in wellness. And what I'm doing basically is recreating my path and who the people were and are that have contributed to me, and I think contributed to the culture around wellness, the broadest definition of it, from the physical to the mental, emotional, and spiritual. Jack Kornfield was Yvonne's mentor, and we've been out to Spirit Rock, and I'm planning to drag him into it at some point. And what's his name? Dwayne, Voluntary Simplicity, Dwayne Elgin, who's nearby you. I visited him a few years ago. I read his book when we were living in Costa Rica, and thank heavens, because I've lived below the poverty level most of my professional life, but I've had freedom and wasn't tied down to the medical model. His book made that possible. So
wow.
I've collected 400 names, and I know all but 62 of them. So I feel so incredibly enriched by the opportunities I've had to meet people like Charles Eisenstein, who Bill Kauth said, you got to meet him. And when they came over for Uplift, I tracked him down. And Patch Adams, who actually came to one of my lectures.
Wow.
He and his brother, when I was back at Hopkins in '77, and I met him afterwards. He came up, and total hippie. I thought, well, he told me about this free hospital. Yeah, that'll never happen. So he certainly surprised me. And then when I first opened the center in Mill Valley, Jerry Jampolsky invited me out for lunch and told me about all this love stuff. And yeah, right. We sold 1,000 of his mini courses by the time we finished up with our wellness kit. And that was the same year that the Walkman came out. And I thought that was a stupid idea too. So my powers of prediction are somewhat.
No. We probably shouldn't ask you about your predictions about the coronavirus.
No, I'm just praying that it resolves and whatever is unfolding. Because the big lesson for me actually came from the Abraham Hicks material, when I learned how to appreciate instead of criticize, because I was trained to find the problem and fix it. I'm a 1 on the Enneagram. I know how it should be, and this ain't it. So it's been a real transformation for me to appreciate rather than fix and analyze and do all those doctorly things. So, well, Joan, I'm just ending a 36-hour fast, and I'm starving, so I'm going to go down and have.
Wow, have fun.
What a
Have
delightful-
fun, and I'll send you, I'll get you and Andy in touch.
Do that,
Each
yes.
other, okay?